Welcome to APUSH. When we last left our heroes, we were mired in the depths of the Great Depression. And so, obviously, massive economic hardship, worst economic crisis in our country's history, is going to lead to some redirection as far as government policy goes. And so today we're going to be looking at the quote unquote New Deal of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So, things you need to know here. We're going to look at the goals of the quote unquote first New Deal. We're going to assess the responses of different groups to FDR's platform. And then we're going to, of course, try to analyze the extent to which Roosevelt's first New Deal was effective. So let's introduce Franklin Roosevelt first. In the election of 1932, it was pretty obvious that Herbert Hoover wasn't going to win re-election for all the bonus army-related obvious reasons. And so instead, what we get is Franklin Roosevelt as the Democratic nominee. He's going to, of course, win in a landslide, and he's going to propose what he calls the New Deal. He was a distant cousin of Theodore Roosevelt, and he's going to use his ostensible uncles, or not his relatives, sort of branding strategy by laying out this platform that, again, he calls the New Deal, which is going to be massive expansion of government programs to try to tackle this. And so, of course, critics of Roosevelt would argue that this is socialism/communism, but enough Americans were unhappy with Hoover's leadership that Roosevelt is able to win relatively easily, as we can see here. Hoover is from Pennsylvania, just as a side note. So now Franklin Delano Roosevelt is president, and he's going to lay out a very, very aggressive platform throughout what's called the first 100 days. It's noteworthy that because of the massive success and scope of this platform, every president is now more or less judged by their first 100 days. And it's become sort of a benchmark, or it's really a benchmark as far as how successful your administration is going to be at using the momentum of winning an election to try to create massive change. So things that are happening. One, prohibition gone. We're going to pass a new amendment getting rid of prohibition in order to both allow people to drink and allow the federal government to tax alcohol. So that's good. Roosevelt goes on and addresses the nation, gives a national address, basically trying to reassure people. He's going to declare a 4-day bank holiday in order to stop the bank failures and get some legislation passed to sort of support banks. And he's going to pass a whole array of other things, basically getting this stuff rubber stamped by Congress, who gives Roosevelt a blank check to pretty much do what he wants. And so here we see Roosevelt dealing out his New Deal of programs to try to tackle all the specific issues of the Great Depression. The main Roosevelt's main platform, or the main tools that he uses, are all of these governmental programs that become known as alphabet soup. They all of them generally go by their acronyms, and each of them are tailored to try to tackle a specific symptom of the Great Depression. And so it should be noteworthy that there's no real overarching philosophy here. It's more Roosevelt and his labor secretary, Frances Perkins, who really is the architect of a lot of this stuff. She is going to try to tailor these programs to specific challenges and to try to end the Great Depression by basically dealing with all of its symptoms. And then, of course, if it's ineffective, they'll pass something else. When we talk about the New Deal, we generally break it down into 3 categories, known as the 3 Rs. On the one hand, you get relief programs designed to give people work and to try to provide direct aid. So Federal Emergency Relief Act gives people aid. The Civilian Conservation Corps puts people to work, things like that. Then you have the recovery part, whose goal is to sort of rebuild the U.S. economy to try to get businesses and farmers back working again. And then finally, you have the reform pieces, which try to prevent the Great Depression from happening again by trying to deal with what they saw as some of the structural problems that led to the Great Depression. So first, relief. We get a whole bunch of different stuff here. Obviously, as I mentioned before, FERA provides direct aid to states to distribute as they choose. The Civilian Conservation Corps puts tons of people to work, building public works, building dams, carving presidents' faces into mountains, essential stuff like that, with the goal being, again, we're priming the pump. And so we're going to give out $600 billion to states in order to fund these programs, with the hope that putting people back to work will spur spending and jumpstart the economy. As far as recovery goes, these were some of the more problematic because the NRA is the National Recovery Administration. They regulate industry, mandated wages and prices, which, the government basically not nationalizing industry, but like standardizing industry is somewhat problematic. But probably the most important part of this is the Federal Deposit Insurance Commission, or FDIC, which insures bank deposits in order to stop bank runs from happening in the future. And probably the least effective of these was the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which tried to raise farm prices by, one, paying farmers not to plant, which, considering that that people were having issues with hunger in a lot of America's cities, this was relatively unpopular. And also by destroying tons of livestock, which, again, people hungry in cities, waiting in bread lines, not super happy with, taking a bunch of cows out and shooting them and dumping them in a mass grave. So the problem is, of course, in order to help farmers, you have to raise farm prices. But in order to raise farm prices, you also have to raise food prices. So it's the constant rural or urban issue in which the stuff that's in the interest of one is absolutely detrimental to the other. So recovery is probably the most mixed bag here. And then as far as reform goes, we're going to see stuff like the TVA, which is going to establish hydroelectric dams throughout Tennessee. And this is going to be of course, provides electrification, provides jobs, flood control, things like that. And it's going to be so successful that they're going to eventually expand it out to the whole country. We already mentioned FDIC, of course, which then, of course, reforms bank deposits, ensures banking deposits, preventing runs on banks. And we're going to see the Indian Reorganization Act, which moves the Native Americans back onto reservations, admittedly not as large as the reservations as from before the Dawes Act, but gives back some measure of tribal autonomy to Native Americans, which, good? I think good. Probably good. It really depends. The course of this is going to somewhat depend on where the reservation is, which, again, this is always the problem with Native American reform. One of the issues that FDR had is that he was unwilling to run significant long-term deficits. He ran some significant short-term deficits, but he was always trying, and admittedly failing, but trying to balance the budget. So at the same time he was proposing all this relief stuff, we're going to substantially increase the tax rate, which again slows the economy further. And we're going to cut pensions to World War I veterans, which takes money out of people's pockets and is incredibly unpopular. And so there's this real question of FDR as a sort of a modern liberal, because he really wasn't comfortable with the type of deficit spending that's become endemic in the US system at this point. And so on the one hand, he's pursuing expansionist policies, like putting people back to work. And on the other hand, he's using contractionary policies like raising taxes and cutting federal benefits. And so these sort of work in conjunction to really limit the effectiveness of a lot of FDR's programs. And so as the government and as the Great Depression does not end in FDR's first term, we see growing extremism. On the one hand, there's a fascist plot to seize control of the government. A group of business leaders are discovered by the FBI to be trying to overthrow FDR and install General Smedley Butler as a fascist dictator. They are, of course, exposed, and the whole thing does not happen, but it is kind of terrifying that there was an attempt to overthrow the U.S. government and install fascists in it. Admittedly, Smedley Butler wanted no part of this plot, so there was very little chance of it succeeding. But we used to tend to think that we are immune from these type of coup attempts. And, and that's just not the case. Francis Townsend proposes old age pensions for old people who are struggling, and so he gets a lot of commemorative quilts made in his honor. But that's seen as too extreme, at least in the first New Deal. And Father Coughlin here, Charles Coughlin, is going to run a platform called Social Justice, where he uses his position as a Catholic priest and the radio to build a huge following, first backing FDR and then basically arguing FDR should go further. Also, pushing a bunch of racist propaganda as far as why the Great Depression is happening. So there's all that fun stuff. Probably the most successful extremist was Huey Long, who was the governor of Louisiana. He was known as the Kingfish on account of his mastering of Louisiana politics. And he ran a movement called the Share Our Wealth Society with the slogan, "Every man a king." His plan was basically a massive redistribution of wealth. He planned to cap incomes and personal fortunes. He planned to redistribute all that wealth and set minimum incomes and minimum family wealths, and so basically take from the rich and give to the poor. And he was planning to challenge FDR in the Democratic primary, or challenge him for the Democratic nomination in 1936, when he was assassinated by a political rival in Louisiana. And so his president or his move towards the presidency dies, as does the Share Our Wealth Society, which is really the first sort of broad socialist movement that would get anywhere close to working. So the results of all this, unemployment still incredibly high, Great Depression still Great Depressioning, farm foreclosures still substantial, Dust Bowl still dust bowling, and so it's really tough. I mean, so I guess the strength of the New Deal is that it gave people hope that the government was doing something. The weakness of the New Deal is none of the things that they did were particularly effective at actually alleviating the Great Depression, and most economists think it's because it was an order of magnitude too small. FDR just didn't have a big enough vision for what it would take to actually end the Great Depression. And quite frankly, I don't know that the country would have had the political will to do it, even if he had. So is the first New Deal successful? Man, it depends on what you're looking at. So that brings us back to our objectives for today. Hopefully you can answer these in some substantive detail. And when we come back tomorrow, we'll look at the second New Deal and FDR's attempt to fix some of the problems and to guide us out of this Great Depression.